Hey, and welcome everybody to my YouTube channel. I'm International Master William Paschall. So this is Video Chess Training, a YouTube channel I've dedicated to instruction here on the internet. Please don't forget to subscribe and like. Today's title is an instructive miniature. We're taking a look at a casual game I played online that has interesting and long-lasting ramifications. And I think that we can draw a lot of practical use out of this little example. So white plays d4. I'm playing black in this game, and I'm surprised in the opening by a kind of somewhat unusual opening. We intended to play some kind of Indian defense, either King's Indian or Nimzo Indian. In this case, I was playing for the Nimzo Indian. White plays c4, and I played e6. So here, white normally plays one of two moves, usually knight to c3 or knight to f3, and sometimes you'll see g3 with the intention of white fianchettoing the bishop on g2. Other than that, there aren't a lot of moves that white can play. Perhaps e3. Sometimes you might see something weird like f3. You'll occasionally see a3, maybe preventing bishop b4. But my opponent plays another rare move here, which is actually, I think, one of the better ones that white can play, bishop g5. And I was immediately put in an uncomfortable situation because this is just not a variation you encounter very often. And that's a good thing. When you're playing something that the opponent doesn't expect, you're usually at an advantage. So the power of the value of the surprise weapon here, very effective. I think I faced this move just once in what wasn't even a rated game. I think I faced it really once in a online sort of training banter game against Grandmaster Tiomkin, and that was many, many, many years ago. So in all my career, I think I faced this variation just once in a semi-serious game. Bishop g5, and I don't really know what the right approach is for black here. There's a lot of different options. This variation, by the way, is named the Seirawan Attack, kind of arbitrary naming since it has been played many, many, many games in the history of chess. If you look in a major chess database, you'll find really thousands of games white's played bishop g5. Surprisingly popular. So what to do here? I mean, normally we're playing e6 in this setup with knight f6 and e6. Black is intending to play either the Nimzo Indian or the Queen's Indian with b6. So we want to play something that's akin to the formation that we're used to. But if bishop to b4, this is really the problem. Knight d2 now for white. And what we have is kind of cross between a Bogo Indian and a Nimzo, when white's bishop is pretty well placed actively on g5. So I think this is kind of somewhat good variation for white. We do have a lot of options, though. We could play h6 after bishop g5, h6, and mostly white will play bishop h4 here. I don't see anything wrong with bishop f4, perhaps inducing a tiny weakness in the black structure, though h6 can be a somewhat useful move. Mostly white would play bishop h4. I don't think you should give up the bishop on f6 when black recaptures with the queen. Really has the bishop pair without white getting any really great concrete advantage. I think if e4, white tries to play like that, the dark squares in the position like d4 are not so great for white here. So black has a good game with the bishop pair there. So mostly you would face bishop h4. But I didn't really want to commit to weakening my structure, and I'm curious what really the best move is for black here. d5 is another move that just transposes to normal lines. So I saw one game, maybe the original game that gave this variation its name, where Ulf Andersson played a plan with b6, and his opponent was Yasser Seirawan. So I think this game from 1983 may have been one of the games, or the game where Seirawan was given the name for this variation. But honestly, the Queen's Indian formation is okay, but all Ulf Andersson got was basically a kind of Nimzo Indian. After knight c3, I think bishop b4, queen c2, it seemed like the game just became a transposition to a classical Nimzo-Indian. And Anderson was actually kind of in an unpleasant situation in that game. So I think that it would have been better to play something more fluid, more flexible for black. It depends on your approach, but it looks like c5 is a very interesting move to me. This is a dynamic move, and I think that, as with many sidelines against the Indian defenses, it can be exploited. The bishop g5 can be exploited perhaps by playing c5 with the most dynamic possible counterplay. So we open up the queen, the possibility for the queen on the d8, a5 diagonal. We're attacking dark squares. We're threatening to unpin our queen in a lot of variations. I think this is clearly the most interesting move and the most independent move for black. And after c5, in my casual game, white played d5. I think this is critical. And most strong players who have played this variation have played d5. Instead of d5, white has other moves. You could simply play knight f3 or something like that, but it's not really dangerous for black. I think that you would end up in some kind of symmetrical English where white has developed the bishop a little too early on g5. So d5 is the critical move. And then the question is, should black exchange on d5 or not? And I decided to take on d5, though honestly, d6 deserves a lot of consideration. Maybe we could play d6 first with the idea of taking on d5 at a later time. So that's interesting as well. I played e takes d, and white recaptures c takes d, and now I played d6. And this position actually I was drawn to because it reminds me of a variation of the Blumenfeld gambit that I play with black. The Blumenfeld gambit, after d4, knight f6, c4, e6, you would find a variation like this. Knight f3, c5, d5, b5, and white's main move is bishop g5 here. So you'll understand what I'm saying when I see a parallel in this position. This is a major variation of the Blumenfeld that I've played a lot for black, but here we've committed our b pawn to b5, and white has played knight f3. So the position is similar, but a bit more dynamic than the position in the game. But nevertheless, there are very similar possibilities and tactical tricks that are possible here. After d6, white played a very rare move in this position. Having looked in the database, I found this was rarely played, I think because people normally want to develop their pieces, So the other problem is with e4, the move played in the game, I think that a lot of players would be thinking, oh, well, he can unpin his knight and win the pawn in e4. But it turns out that that's not really possible. If we play h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, knight takes e4, white actually wins a piece with queen a4 check. This is actually an important theme from the game that I played, and a kind of rare tactic in chess openings. Queen a4 check, winning a piece. The only other variation I can think of where it's very common is in a rare line of Sicilian after e4, c5. I'll show you. After e4, c5, knight f3, d6, c3, knight f6, white plays bishop e2, and if knight takes e4, queen a4 check wins a piece. So this is not really the most common tactic in the world. In the actual game, which was a quick pace blitz game online, my opponent played e4. I didn't really consider this more on general positional grounds. Weakening my king side didn't appeal to me, so I quickly played bishop e7. Bishop e7 here, I think, is the best move, and white played knight to c3. And this is really the critical position for our video today. Instructive miniature, how to lose quickly with black in this position, as I did. But a very interesting position theoretically, because it's pretty rare. The theory isn't well worked out. I believe there was once an article in the New in Chess yearbook long ago about this variation. That's something you might want to research, but In general, still kind of unknown territory here for most players. What should black do in this position? My main idea was to try to win a pawn with the idea of knight takes d5. And I very much wanted to play knight takes d5. But after knight takes d5, I felt that white would get good compensation for the pawn. And it turns out that my fears are well-founded. After bishop e5 check, I think that black must play king f8 here. And of course the whole mechanism works because if white plays bishop takes e7, we recapture with the knight, and we're up a pawn. Although white might have some strategic compensation, in that example it wouldn't be very much. So the best is for white to take with the queen. You see we've lost the right to castle, which is already some compensation for white, significant compensation. And after bishop takes g5, white just smoothly keeps developing with rook to d1, pressuring the d6 pawn. And in my opinion, and the chess engine's opinion as well, black has a reasonable game, but will not be able to keep the extra pawn. So it looks like white's slightly better, and I did analyze this in some depth here. If you'd like to take a deeper look, instead of bishop e7, which I think is bad, trying to just doggedly hold on to the pawn when white has the move e5, with advantage probably, black should give the pawn back with queen e7, and after knight f3, bishop f6, this is a very logical line now, castles, bishop e6, and white gets the pawn back finally with queen takes d6, queen takes d6, rook takes d6, and be careful here, probably bishop e7, and I think the white is a tiny bit better after rook e2. Black is okay. a6, bishop retreats, knight c6. White has very good control of the d5 square, but they have given up the bishop pair. And so I think it's about equal, although I guess white's a tiny, tiny bit better. The question, if you're black, you could play this simplifying variation with knight takes d5, but it's a question of what you're trying to do. If you're playing a weaker player and you're trying to win, probably this wouldn't be great. If you're playing an equal or better player and you're willing to accept the game might be a draw, then knight takes d5 is okay. So we wanted to play for a win against our opponent, and I rejected knight takes d5. What did we do? Well, we used another move that is common in the Blumenfeld, as I mentioned. The Blumenfeld I play where my pawn is on b5, very significant, because after knight takes e4, my pawn is not on b5. As you can imagine, I'm vulnerable to the tactic queen a4 check. And in this comical little miniature, my opponent didn't see it either. So he didn't play queen a4 check. He played bishop takes e7, which is a big mistake. White should play queen a4 check when white wins a piece and the game after queen a4 check. So, big problem. King f8 not possible here because of bishop takes e7 check, check, and wins the piece on e4. This would have been decisive, but my opponent here comically didn't see queen a4 check. Instead, I was fearful of bishop b5 in this position after knight takes e4, but I calculated that it shouldn't be a problem because of king f8. That was my big worry. That was not the problem. Queen a4 check wins a piece. So instead, my opponent played bishop takes e7, and suddenly it might be okay. Queen takes e7, but alas, queen a4 check, and my opponent finally saw it. I finally realized I had completely missed queen a4 check. And so white will win this knight on e4. And I resigned. This casual game I played online here mistakenly. So our lesson from this to take away is don't rush to quick decisions, especially when it comes to like resigning or accepting a draw. Make sure your emotions aren't involved in making a decision about a practical tournament game or something like that. So I quickly was upset with myself. I blundered queen a4 check. I should just resign. Of course, if it was a tournament game, I would have probably found the antidote here for black. But in a blitz game, I was just kind of like, okay, let's move on to the next game and play another one. I blundered. It's okay. I'm going to resign. But the thing is that you always have to take everything in consideration and make the decision only after you've analyzed all the possibilities. I could have played king d8, and king d8 is actually a move that should occur to Nimzo-Indian type of players, because Anatoly Karpov, former world champion, actually used this maneuver in the Leningrad Nimzo-Indian variation to play king d8 and king c7 sometimes. This is not an unknown king maneuver, king d8, and the idea here is that the e file is open, so either way that white recaptures on e4, queen takes e4, queen takes e4, knight takes e4, and rook e8, and we will win back a piece for a pawn, which is the exact amount of material we're down. And in fact, I think black is slightly better. So not only did I resign in a position that I'm not losing, I resign in a position where I'm better. Because of the pawn structure, I think that the pawn on d5 is a liability for white. It's kind of weak. And he also has a bishop that's somewhat bad, blocked in by pawns on d5 and maybe e4 if we play something like f3 and f5, for example. White might remain with a pawn structure based on white squares when the white square bishop is a really inactive kind of piece. So maybe white's better off objectively not trading queens here and trying for something more complicated with knight takes e4, f5. But nevertheless, the black king will remain safe on c7. So I prefer black. If white castles queenside, gives the piece back, black has a very safe king, and arguably safer than white's. So when we finally analyze this position for its intrinsic value as an opening system, we go back to the position after bishop e7, knight c3, and we check it out from there. What should I have done? Because this trap loses a piece for black after knight takes e4. Knight takes d5 is equal or a tiny bit better for white. We can follow one game that was played by the French international master Marie Sibag, where she played castles, which is what I played in analysis later, and I think was also played by a game by the Iranian grandmaster Gayam. So this is one possibility, castles, and there was a game Husari versus Gayam where it went, let's see, knight to f3, I believe, when Gayam, interestingly, could have played knight takes e4 here, and he opted not to. And he's a strong player, very, very talented tactically. So I'm wondering if he chose to play bishop g4, but I'm wondering if he saw knight takes e4 and just rejected it because he didn't think it was good enough to try to win against a weaker player. So interesting question. Only Gayam could answer, but knight takes e4 is interesting because of the variation knight takes e4 f5. And I looked at this in some depth, and it looks like it's quite complicated, where maybe black can win the piece back with plenty of compensation. So that's something to take a look at. Gayam opted not to do that. He had a slightly worse position, but ended up beating this weaker master. But one thing I wanted to mention before we finish out the video here is that this is possible. I would imagine something like rook e8 would be possible too. But instead of castles and this, another possibility exists for black to play a6 right away. And this is really kind of tying something in between this position and the Blumenfeld gambit that I was talking about earlier, because giving us the ability to play b5 very quickly, and also the control of b5 makes a big difference in this position. For example, if white makes the reflexive move a4 in this position, suddenly everything's changed. And the variation with knight takes d5 for black is actually better for black. After this, white no longer has bishop b5 check available. So it's a huge difference. After queen takes d5, bishop takes g5, black's going to be able to castle queen or kingside here, and I don't think that, I would prefer white. I think white is worse in this position. Whereas in the other version where you can play bishop b5 check, I think that white is totally fine and slightly better. So this reflexive move a4 is a mistake and could easily be played by white. Most players would play that. White should play knight f3. I believe here, knight f3 guarding the g5 bishop, and it's not that it's such an easy position for white. An alternative could be bishop d3 for white in this kind of position, but again, knight takes d5 is going to be a problem. So you have to play knight f3 to guard the bishop on g5, guard against tactics of knight takes d5. So you can play knight takes d5, queen takes d5. And after knight f3, black can play b5 with queenside counterplay. So I think that's a really interesting and kind of unexplored move. I'm not sure there are any games with this idea of a6. But that's one possibility. Another one is castles. And, for example, in this type of position, black might play something like after bishop f4, by the way, a good move, the most interesting move after castles, black might play this move, bishop d7, which is very hard to find, with the idea of counterplay with b5 very quickly. So I would have played something like rook e8. I think this is also very logical and playable for black. But this move a little more tricky. Bishop d7, when usually we'll be developing the knight with knight a6, trying to get in a quick b5. But bishop f4 is the move I think that is most critical because it avoids these exchanges of pieces with bishop on g5 versus bishop on e7, and it avoids all the exchanges that can kind of ease black's cramped position. You could play even bishop d2, for example, for white, but I think bishop f4 makes sense because you're putting pressure on the d6 pawn, which is the base of black's Benoni pawn chain. And anyway, bishop f4 against the Benoni is a very common sort of variation and idea in general strategically. So we could also have e5 at some point, and this I think would be the kind of critical continuation for both sides, when a6 might be a little bit slow here. So I think bishop d7 interesting, and rook e8 rather kind of standard. But certainly still a6 playable, though it's not the same anymore. If you play a6, a4, and black has a problem because we can't play knight a6, and the bishop on c8, classic Benoni problem, is hemmed in. So a little bit messy for black now. After rook e8, maybe white is slightly better, unless we have some kind of tactics with knight takes e4. So anyway, summing up, an interesting variation here, d4, knight f6, c4, e6, bishop g5, c5. Dynamic move, trying to really take advantage of the early bishop g5, the fact that white has left the b2 square weak. There are answers with queen b6 and queen a5. There are other games after d5, pawn takes pawn. Black has tried other experimental stuff like queen b6 in this position is a common idea. But the problem with this for me is that I think white can play a gambit here with knight to c3. And after knight c3, queen takes b2, bishop d2. To me, this position looks suspiciously similar to some dangerous pawn sacrifices in the Trompowsky. So I'm not sure that this is what we really want to do with black, to kind of lose the initiative and give white, the chance to kind of dictate the course of the game and take control of the game. So I don't really like queen b6. I think this is a very, very good way for black to play. As I played in a game with d6 again, pretty much. Only question would be, do you want to maybe play around with some move orders with d6? But the one problem is that I've seen some games where white actually takes on e6. Some good players have actually taken on e6 and played the resulting structure in a favorable way for white. So that's another possibility to have to worry about. If we take, white has to take back, play d6, and then either knight c3 or e4 are playable, as in the game. I think bishop e7 essential, and trying to exchange the bad bishop, the bishop on g5, taking advantage of that possibility, black's main idea. And again, knight c3, don't ever do this, what I did here. The knight takes e4, castles, or a6. Those are our two main continuations. And knight takes d5, good enough for a draw, probably, but not really the best move. I think black wants to play for a win, wants to play for an interesting game, so either a6 or castles, and it would have been an interesting struggle. So anyway, an interesting miniature, and a lot going on there, and it was fun to take a look at a kind of rare opening by white, this so-called Seirawan Attack. I think c5, bishop e7, and d6, a very compact kind of formation and easy variation for black to play. Of course, you have to be comfortable with the pawn structure, the Benoni type of pawn structure here, but I think we learned a lot from just more or less 10 moves. Thanks for tuning into my YouTube channel. I'm International Master William Paschall, and don't forget to subscribe and like this video, and subscribe to the channel. Okay, have a good day, everybody. See you later. Bye-bye.